Hello everybody. I've been called to a meeting and I can't be in class today. We were scheduled to talk about Lloyd Humphrey's study, but I'm going to save that for Monday. Instead, I'm going to create this video lecture on IRB's institutional review boards for you for Wednesday's class, which I'm going to be missing. And then we'll still be on cycle, and then I can walk you through the Lloyd Humphrey studies, which is a little complicated and it's a little harder to put on videotape. So we'll get there though on Monday. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about IRBs, institutional review boards, and I've mentioned them already, and we know a little bit about them. But basically, an IRB has one job: to ensure that risk is minimized for participants, human participants in research, and related to that has to do with, is the project justified given the amount of risk that involves that is involved in the project. Now, sometimes they used to go by other names before we all settled on the term IRB. Sometimes they were referred to as independent ethics committees or ethical review boards, but now they're codified in the federal regulations as institutional review boards. This all happened in 1974. That's when the National Research Act was passed, and it set definitions, expectations, and it also created a commission to talk about and discuss and write up some guidelines for human research ethics. This commission was called the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, so it included psychology explicitly, as well as many other social sciences. And it worked with other agencies to come up with an important report. This report was called the Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects of Research. And this became known as the Belmont Report because that's where they met a lot. The Belmont Report really was the outcome or the product of the Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Now, the thing about the Belmont Report is that it came up with 3 guiding principles in the 1970s. And you'll find some of these principles familiar because they live on in the APA Code of Ethics. In particular, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And we already know about those terms already. Respect for persons means protecting the autonomy of all people, treating them with courtesy, and allowing for informed consent. Beneficence means maximizing the benefits of the research project while minimizing the risks. Do no harm, do good. And justice refers to ensuring reasonable, non-exploitative, well-considered procedures that are administered fairly to all people, and that all people are protected evenly, or equitably, I should say. Now, they did distinguish between biomedical and behavioral research, but they considered both. And they also distinguished between practice of accepted therapies and other types of therapies. Now, one of the most important things that came out of the Belmont Report was guidelines for informed consent. What constitutes informed consent? Of course, it involves information. The person has to understand it, so that's comprehension, and also voluntariness. The person must not be coerced into participating in the research project. Now, in the PowerPoint slide that you can download, oops, I should have advanced that slide already. The Belmont Report, there's a nice video on a retrospective on the Belmont Report. And I really encourage you to watch it. I do ask a couple of questions here and there on the exam about this video, but it's this video was made in 2000s, so it's people reflecting back on their work in the 1970s, and it's really kind of amazing how these different people came together and did this work to create guidelines for ethical treatment of human research participants in research, all types of research. And so why the 1970s? Why the 1970s? because something important happened in the early 1970s, and that is the revelation of the Tuskegee experiment, the Tuskegee study, that is, and that how significant protocols needed to be developed to prevent something like that happening again. Okay, so watch that video. It's in the PowerPoint slide. They created a checklist for what should be in a informed consent form. I talked a little bit about a list about major issues when we talked about the APA code, but the Belmont report has a thorough list because it considers lots of different things. But of course it involves a statement that a study involves research. They want people to know that they're actually involved in a research project. The explanation of the study's purpose, the duration of the project, the description of the procedures to be followed, identification of any experimental procedures, things that are unusual, description of any reasonable foreseeable risks or discomforts. Also, description of any benefits to the subject, disclosure of appropriate and alternative procedures or courses of treatment. That's really important for biomedical research, is that people understand that that if there could be other ways of dealing with their illness, that they don't have to be in this experiment. A statement describing confidentiality. Again, I always follow mine up with confidential to the fullest extent of the law. And explanation as to whether any compensation, any medical treatments are available, if injury occurs, and if so, what would they consist of, and whether further information may be obtained about these issues. For some research, it's really important that people understand that injuries could happen in certain lines of research. In our university, most of the psychology research doesn't lend itself to injuries, but we have a biodynamic lab where physical therapists, exercise researchers are doing research, and involves a lot of physical movement, sometimes lifting weights. Injuries can happen. And so an informed consent should include who to contact for answers about pertinent questions about the research and subject's rights, and who to contact if there's an injury to the subject, the participant. And of course, participation needs to be explicitly described as voluntary, that if they refuse to participate, there's no penalty, and they may discontinue participation at any time without penalty or loss of benefits. Standard stuff now for us in terms of what we've been talking about. However, I like this video that you can watch again through the PowerPoint presentation, and it's going to talk about informed consent and somebody trying to figure out how to develop informed consent given their research project. And we think that all of this is very straightforward for every project, but the truth is there are sometimes situations in a project where you have to think very carefully, how am I gaining real informed consent in this project? Because not everybody is a good reader, not everybody will understand certain words, not everybody will feel that they have the right to leave the experiment just from an experimenter saying so. So we have to really make sure that people understand their rights, understand the project, and can make their own decisions. Okay, so watch this video on informed consent. That'll be good. All right, so now, the National Research Act of 1974 set definitions and expectations of an IRB, and there's currently 3 levels of review. It's kind of interesting, but there may be 4 levels coming very soon. But for right now, there's 3 levels of review: exempt, expedited, and full review. Exempt means, well, let me start with full review. Full review is when the researcher meets with the entire board, which could be several people, and describes the research and then answers questions about the risk to participants. And then there's a vote on whether or not the research should occur. Expedited is a slightly faster process. Maybe only 1 or 2 people from the board review the IRB application and that describes the study, and they still have to hold up to the same standards, but it's certain experiments qualify for an expedited review, and things can go through pretty fast. And then finally, there's exempt. And this is research that maybe involves program assessment or educational research, kind of normal educational type of research, where there's very little risk to participants, will generally be reviewed by the chair and declared exempt from further review, and people can go do their research. Okay, so we know from the National Research Act that institutional review boards should have at least 5 members. The members should have enough experience, expertise, and diversity to make an informed decision on whether the research is ethical. And at a college like ours, the board is mostly comprised of faculty, a couple of administrators, who all have experiences with this sort of thing, research and ethics, and those who don't have experience with researching with human participants, they get a little extra training, and so that we're all on the same page, we understand our job as IRB members. I was an IRB member for many years, then I was the chair of an IRB for 4 years, and so I've had lots of experience with this, and everybody comes forward with different levels of knowledge, different expertise, but collectively we do a really good job of ensuring the safety of our human participants. Okay, so one of the things that the IRB looks at is vulnerable subjects. Most of the time research done at universities is done with healthy adults, but sometimes we also do research with women who are pregnant, prisoners, children, and these are folks who, no matter what the research is, gets an extra look by the Institutional Review Board because we want to make sure that folks are not being exploited or taken advantage of. The IRB generally also has men and women both on the committee to ensure some diversity. Let's see here now. Oops. So this next slide is as a video of somebody talking to somebody about composition of an IRB, and it's an administrator going to the head IRB person or advisor on IRBs, and you can see how in this video the administrator is really concerned about making sure that there's administrators on there and that everything is nailed down in terms of liability for the university, but really the focus needs to be on protecting human participants and not so much the liability of the university. If we protect human subjects, then the university doesn't have to worry very much at all. Now here's a slide on the IRB as it was when I was chair in 2014, and or just after I was chair in 2014. And what you'll see here is that there's 3 administrators and the rest are faculty. They come from all the different colleges. There's about equal men and equal women on the committee. Some of them are scientists, some of them are scientists who work with people, some of them are non-scientists. That's a very important quality. Some people not being scientists. And there's one person from outside the university whose job it is to provide that outside perspective so that academics don't just academic research all day long. Okay, so again, it's very important that the oops, I'm getting away. Oh, okay. So, sorry, we're good. The members must not be all of the same profession, so we need diversity in perspectives. There has to be at least one scientist and one non-scientist. Usually there's a couple of scientists and a couple of non-scientists. The IRB must include at least one person who is not affiliated with the university. We just refer to that person as a community member sometimes. I was very fortunate when I was IRB chair to have somebody who was a current Catholic priest, but previous to that he was a medical doctor who also did some work in bioethics and medical ethics. So he had a great perspective of medicine, being a doctor, ethics, as well as being a community leader and understanding maybe the plight of people who are disadvantaged a little bit better than academics. So he was a great person to have on the board. In fact, our IRB also tried to make sure there were people of color and people from different cultures on the board, just to have that extra perspective to make sure that we weren't taking advantage of people. Now, some people think there's always concerns about the IRB, and some people think the IRBs just don't go far enough in protecting human subjects. Some people think the IRBs go too far and they're stopping good research, and so some people say that means we're well balanced, or we're doing our job if both ends of the continuum are unhappy with us. That's not really the way I look at it, but I think we as an IRB member always try to work with the researchers to help them figure out a way to minimize risk if they haven't done a great job of doing so. So our job is to always hold the line on and say research cannot go forward, but we also try to work with researchers to figure out a good path. Ultimately, there's always some risk in an experiment, and so there's this cost-benefit analysis we do in terms of justification. Is the research worth it, given the risk that's involved? Okay. IRBs, have there's a lot of misconceptions about IRBs. For example, all IRB decisions are based on federal, local statutes or written laws, and while federal laws are established the IRB and how we do a lot of things, there's still a lot of subjectivity involved with understanding risk to participants. So these are in many ways just guidelines for helping us make the right decision, but it's really up to people to use their common sense to understand things from a different perspective than their own in order to protect people. Another myth is that these federal principles were originally developed for medical research only and not psychological or behavioral research. That's not true. They always included behavioral research. By 1973, there were studies like the Milgram study had already been out there for 10 years. Studies, other social psychological studies out there had raised some eyebrows about the ethics involved. Okay, myth 3 is all research must go before an IRB, and really only research that poses more than a minimal risk or involves vulnerable participants has to go through the IRB. Myth number 4 is deception is not permitted under federal guidelines. Well, that's definitely not true. Deception is permitted, but it must be justified, and that the research can't be done otherwise, and that the research is potentially worth it. Okay, so next, myth 5, some proposals do not need to be reviewed. It's true that, but really, most IRBs require projects be submitted to them first and let the IRB chair decide whether or not research is exempt from the research review, from the IRB review. Okay, so at this point, you should have printed up the readings, hopefully the PowerPoint slides, and you're writing notes in the margins as I'm doing them. But if you haven't yet, you can stop the video and print up the Armstrong example of an IRB application, and then come back to the video and we'll talk about some of the things that should be in an IRB. And for your assignment is to figure out, of these 19 or so questions that I'm going to bring up, are there any that the Armstrong IRB does not address well? Okay, so go get the Armstrong IRB printed up, and so you can make some notes in the margins on that too, and then we'll talk about what IRB should have. Okay, so hopefully you have it in front of you, and so whenever we have an IRB application, they're going to want to know questions about the investigator. who is the primary investigator and who is supervising student researchers or other researchers involved with the project. They want to know if anybody will be assisting you. And have you or others whose names are listed on the IRB had any experiences with this kind of research? We want to know if you're qualified, basically. That's important. We want to know about the nature or the purpose of the research. Will the research participants be asked to do certain things? We want to know everything that the research participants are going to be asked to do. We want to know if deception will be used, and if it is, why? What is the nature of the deception? Because some deception could go way too far, and that's not good either. Will the participants risk any harm? Physical, psychological, legal, social harm? If there are any risks, how does the researcher justify them? Or maybe another way of saying it is, how will the researcher minimize those risks? About the research participants, how will you recruit the participants, research participants? IRBs will always have a section. How are you asking people to participate? How do you plan to explain the research and obtain their informed consent? What should be the general characteristics of your research participants? We want to know, how old they're going to be, where they come from, institutional affiliation. Essentially, we want to make sure you're not seeking out vulnerable populations. Do any of the subjects have to have a special characteristic? And it could be something that's very clearly defined as being a risk, such as being a pregnant woman, children, prisoners, maybe somebody with alcoholism or any other illness. But there could be anything, in terms of the special characteristics. For example, in physical therapy, they're often doing projects where they request people who have back pain or knee pain, and we need to know that, because now they're kind of walking in to the experiment as a vulnerable person, and we want to know what safeguards are going to be in place. Also, we need to know if there are any mental or physical states that are important in this research. In other words, are you seeking out people who are psychologically dealing with issues, or does your research require even emotional stability? If there's any electrical or mechanical equipment involved, we need to know how it was safety tested and what risks there are for somebody using it. We need to know if there are any standardized tests or surveys. What information will be provided to participants about their scores? That's an important thing. So if you tell people they're going to take an IQ test and then you tell them the score, they may not be prepared to hear that. How will you debrief people? That's an important question too. Okay, so these, I think there are 19 questions, are listed in your reading assignment, but also they're in this PowerPoint slide. And so look back and look through and see if you can find where in the IRB they addressed these issues. There's at least one, maybe two things that aren't addressed well in the Armstrong IRB application. Okay, let's see here. Did I cover everything? I think so. Okay, so the take home of this lecture, this video lecture, and I'm sorry, I'm not there in class, is to know that the IRB is a federally mandated program for all institutions that receive federal funds in any way, shape, or form in order to protect human participants in research. And that can include behavioral research as well as biomedical research. IRB boards are diverse. They have people who are scientists and non-scientists, people in the institution, non-institution, men and women, and maybe other defining characteristics to increase diversity so that all people are, as many people as possible are represented on the board. And a good board and a good IRB application asks lots of questions in order to assess risk to the participants so that they can make a good judgment as to whether or not the project should continue on. Okay, so watch the videos in the PowerPoint. Watch this video, which hopefully you have by now if you're hearing these words. And I'll see you on Monday.